November 2, 1983. Brussels, Belgium. Inside the fortified underground headquarters of NATO's Supreme Allied Command Europe, the lights have been burning for 72 hours without interruption. Somewhere above, the ordinary world continues. Commuters, schoolchildren, the gray autumn streets of a European capital going about its business. Down here, none of that exists. Down here, the war has already begun. Not a real war. Not yet. What is unfolding across the command centers of Western Europe is a military exercise, the most elaborate, the most realistic, and as it will turn out, the most dangerous training drill in the history of the Cold War. The exercise had been designed to test NATO's nuclear release procedures from beginning to end, a full simulation of the transition from conventional warfare to nuclear conflict. It would involve hundreds of thousands of troops, encrypted communications channels, dummy nuclear warhead movements, and the authentic participation of heads of state. It was, in every technical detail, indistinguishable from the real thing. That was the point. That was also the problem. In Moscow, the KGB and GRU, Soviet military intelligence, had been operating for over a year under a classified program called Ryan, an acronym for nuclear missile attack. Ryan had been established by KGB chairman Yuri Andropov, now the general secretary of the Communist Party. Elderly, gravely ill, and consumed by a paranoia that had hardened over decades into something that looked, from the inside, exactly like rational analysis. Andropov was convinced that the United States, under President Ronald Reagan, was actively preparing a first-strike nuclear attack against the Soviet Union. He was wrong, but he was not without reasons. Reagan had, in the preceding years, called the Soviet Union an evil empire, announced the Strategic Defense Initiative, a space-based missile shield that, if completed, would neutralize the Soviet nuclear deterrent entirely, and approved the deployment of Pershing 2 ballistic missiles in West Germany, capable of reaching Moscow in under 10 minutes. From Washington, these were political statements and deterrence strategies. From Moscow, they looked like the systematic dismantling of the balance of terror that had kept the peace for 40 years. Ryan directed KGB residencies across the Western world to watch for specific indicators of imminent nuclear attack, unusual activity at military bases, changes in the movement patterns of political leaders, lights burning in government buildings at unusual hours. When Able Archer 83 began on November 2nd, every one of those indicators lit up simultaneously. NATO command centers across Europe went to unprecedented communication security. Military movements that Ryan had been told to watch for began occurring exactly as the Soviet models had predicted they would. Encrypted message traffic surged. In at least one location, dummy nuclear warheads were physically moved to airfields under armed guard, in procedures identical to actual wartime deployment. Soviet intelligence assets watching NATO installations reported activity entirely consistent with genuine preparation for nuclear first strike. In Moscow, the reports landed on the desks of men who had been primed for exactly this moment. Several Soviet air armies in East Germany and Poland were placed on heightened alert. Nuclear-capable aircraft were readied. The question being asked, in the most secure rooms in the Kremlin, was not whether NATO was preparing to strike. The question was when. What prevented catastrophe was not a single heroic decision, but a combination of factors that, viewed in retrospect, seem almost accidental in their adequacy. A British intelligence asset inside Soviet military intelligence, later identified as Oleg Gordievsky, passed word to London that Soviet anxiety about Able Archer had reached a critical threshold. That intelligence reached CIA analysts who had themselves been arguing, against considerable institutional resistance, that the Soviets genuinely believed an attack was coming. When Able Archer 83 ended on November 11th and the simulated war concluded without escalating into something real, the relief in certain offices in Langley and Whitehall was not procedural. It was the relief of people who had looked at what nearly happened and could not quite believe it had not. The Able Archer crisis was classified for decades. The men and women who understood how close it had come were not permitted to say so. Ronald Reagan, briefed on Gordievsky's intelligence after the exercise ended, was reportedly shaken, genuinely surprised that his rhetoric and his policies had been interpreted in Moscow not as strength but as preparation for murder. The world did not end in November 1983, but it came close enough that the people responsible for preventing it spent the rest of their lives knowing exactly how thin the margin had been. The world did not end in November 1983.